Why stability suddenly felt fragile. Nothing had changed on the surface. Prices were orderly. Volatility remained contained. Headlines spoke of balance and normalization. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, the market began to feel uneasy. This story matters now because stability can be deceptive. It feels like safety, but sometimes it's only the absence of movement, not the presence of strength. When stability suddenly feels fragile, it's usually because something essential has already shifted. To understand how confidence gave way to tension without warning, we need to revisit the moment calm stopped feeling reliable. The shift from stability as safety to stability as fragility is not captured in metrics. It lives in the qualitative experience of participants, in the way hesitation replaces ease, in the way familiar safeguards begin to feel like points of exposure rather than points of protection, in the way the market's apparent calm begins to register not as reassurance, but as a question mark hanging over every trade. It began after prolonged consistency. Markets had adjusted to narrow ranges and predictable reactions. Risk was managed. Expectations were set. Stability became routine, almost comforting. The system appeared to be functioning exactly as designed. But the first reveal came through emotion rather than data. Traders felt hesitant despite favorable conditions. Investors questioned exposure even when nothing looked wrong. The market was stable, but no one felt relaxed. Liquidity hinted at the problem. Depth appeared normal until tested. Small orders moved prices more than expected. Market makers stepped back faster. Stability existed, but only if no one challenged it. Inside institutions, conversations shifted. Risk wasn't increased. It was maintained. New positions required more justification. Stability was no longer an invitation to act. It was a condition to be protected. The most unsettling signal was how participants reacted to minor stress. A small dip produced outsized caution. Not panic, defensiveness. The system responded as if stability might not survive scrutiny. Stability had stopped feeling robust. It felt brittle. And brittle systems don't need large shocks to break. They only need pressure applied in the wrong place. The calm that once reassured now raised questions. Because when stability feels fragile, it's often because it is. And that realization was already spreading quietly through every decision being made. The market hadn't lost balance. It had lost confidence in balance itself. As the sense of fragility spread, behavior shifted faster than price. Participants shortened exposure. Positions were trimmed early. Risk was managed offensively, not because conditions demanded it, but because confidence no longer justified patience. The reveal deepened when familiar safeguards stopped feeling sufficient. Support levels held briefly, then gave way without urgency. Volatility remained modest, yet reactions felt exaggerated. The market wasn't unstable, but it was intolerant of stress. The early conflict emerged inside liquidity. Depth looked normal until it was tested. Then it thinned abruptly. Bids stepped back. Offers widened. The system functioned, but only within narrow boundaries. Stability depended on restraint. Institutions adjusted quietly. Stress scenarios were expanded. Assumptions revised. Capital was held back deliberately. Stability was no longer something to exploit. It was something to defend. The most telling shift was psychological. Participants stopped trusting calm as protection. They assumed fragility until proven otherwise. That inversion mattered more than any data point. It changed how every decision was framed. Small uncertainties carried more weight. Minor events prompted outsized preparation. The market behaved as if it were standing on thin ice. Careful, deliberate, unwilling to move too quickly in any direction. Stability hadn't vanished, but belief in stability had. And without belief, stability becomes conditional. It holds only until tested. It reassures only until questioned. The market was no longer asking whether things were stable. It was asking how easily that stability could break. And that question was already influencing behavior far more than price ever could. The tension reached its peak when stability faced a test it couldn't avoid. Not a crisis, not a shock, just a routine moment that required the market to absorb pressure and keep functioning normally. It didn't. The conflict intensified as participants reacted before prices could. Liquidity thinned instantly at key levels. Orders that should have been absorbed slipped through gaps. Prices moved further than expected on modest volume. The fragility that had been felt quietly was now visible. This wasn't panic selling. It was preemptive retreat. Traders stepped aside rather than step in. Institutions reduced exposure not because they feared collapse, but because they no longer trusted stability to hold under stress. Correlation rose sharply. Assets that once diversified risk moved together as confidence withdrew. The system had already synchronized around caution. When pressure arrived, there was no counterbalance. Attempts to stabilize conditions struggled. Reassurance lacked credibility. Stability that needs reassurance isn't stability anymore. Participants wanted proof that the system could absorb stress, not words saying it should. The market slipped into a defensive posture. Movement slowed. Volatility remained contained, but directionless. Stability survived, but only by becoming restrictive. The system limited itself to avoid breaking. This was the most dangerous phase, because stability hadn't failed. It had revealed its limits. And once limits are exposed, behavior changes permanently. The market learned that calm was conditional, that smoothness depended on cooperation, and that cooperation could not be assumed. The repricing wasn't finished yet, but the illusion was. Stability no longer felt like safety. It felt like something that had to be protected at all costs. And protection always comes with trade-offs. The climax arrived through acceptance rather than collapse. The market finally acknowledged what fragility had been signaling all along. Stability had not disappeared, but it could no longer be taken for granted. Prices adjusted carefully, not violently, deliberately. Liquidity returned in measured steps, demanding compensation for risk that had once been ignored. Participants re-entered with restraint, no longer assuming calm would absorb mistakes. The resolution unfolded as behavior reset. Exposure was rebuilt slowly. Time horizons shortened. Risk was sized for uncertainty instead of smooth continuation. Stability stopped being a baseline and became a condition that had to be earned repeatedly. What changed most was expectation. The market no longer assumed that calm meant strength. It assumed that calm required cooperation, and cooperation could fade. That realization altered how every trade was framed, how every position was sized, how every pause was interpreted. In hindsight, fragility had been visible long before it was acknowledged. It lived in hesitation, in early exits, in the way liquidity stepped back faster than before. Stability hadn't failed suddenly. It had thinned quietly. Modern relevance is everywhere. Markets today still appear calm until they are tested, still reward restraint over conviction, still remind participants that smoothness and resilience are not the same thing. The lesson isn't that stability is dangerous. It's that unexamined stability is. Because when stability suddenly feels fragile, it isn't becoming weak. It's revealing what it has always depended on: belief, coordination, and the willingness of participants to stay. When those begin to fade, stability doesn't shatter. It recalibrates. And the market moves on, changed but aware. The distinction between stability that reflects genuine resilience and stability that reflects the temporary absence of challenge has always been difficult to identify in real time. It requires asking a question that is uncomfortable to ask during periods of apparent success. What would happen to this calm if it were tested? The answer to that question, available only to those willing to probe the system's actual depth, to test liquidity at the edges, to consider the stress scenarios that the prevailing narrative makes feel remote, is the difference between informed confidence and false confidence. Informed confidence knows that the stability it is relying on has been tested and held. False confidence simply assumes that stability observed is stability that will persist. The participants who felt fragility before it became visible were those asking the uncomfortable question. They were noticing that their attempts to probe the system were producing faster than expected responses, that liquidity thinned more readily than the apparent depth suggested it should, that the market's tolerance for even modest deviations from expectation was narrower than the price record implied. These were not large or dramatic signals, but they were consistent, and consistency, in the language of behavior, is more reliable than any single dramatic event. The market was telling those willing to listen that what they were experiencing as stability was actually something more conditional, more dependent on continued cooperation, and more vulnerable to disruption than the surface calm suggested. The fragility was real. It was only the acknowledgement of it that was delayed. Why?